welcome to the Luminaries In and Out of Sect podcast, a show about the sun and how astrologers embody and relate to it. My name is SB Hall, and I'm your host. In today's episode on the Aquarius Sun as the Sect Light, I speak with the incredibly brilliant, prolific astrologer, Kira Ryberg. I'm really excited to be dropping this next episode of my new Sun series, which will continue for the next year. For new listeners, please go back and listen to the Moon series that I've been doing over the last year, where I spoke to different astrologers about their moon sign. These Aquarius Sun episodes were really fun for me to record, and I think they're very engaging conversations. It was so interesting to go right from Saturn's nocturnal sign of Capricorn last month to their diurnal air sign of Aquarius this month, to see the contrast of these signs and how the sun shows up there. In this conversation, we talked about a lot of different sun topics, and I just wanted to plug some of Kira's lectures that relate to the sun that I've personally gotten a lot out of. The main ones are the ninth house lecture, which is the house where the sun joys, perhaps where the sun likes to be most in a chart. The purpose and profession lecture, which talks a lot about the lot of spirit, which is the sun's lot, in contrast to other points or places in the chart, as well as Kira's zodiacal releasing lecture, where she talks about using the lot of spirit in that particular timing technique. In addition, if you haven't already listened and want to hear more of Kira and I chatting about astrology, we did another episode on the lot of fortune earlier last year, so you can check that out too. I provided a link to Kira's lectures in the show notes. As always, if you enjoy the work that I'm doing, please contribute to the podcast sustainability by becoming a supporting member or offering a one-time donation on my website. There you can also find information on my services. I'm currently offering natal and timing consultations, as well as answering horary questions. Hope you enjoy the conversation. All right, Kira Ryberg, thank you so much for being here today. It's good to have you back. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm excited to be back, excited to talk about Aquarius suns, shine some light on what that experience is like. Yeah, I'm doing good.
Yeah, me too. The Capricorn, I'm a Capricorn sun, and so it'll be interesting to have two like very different kind of Saturnians talking to each other about like, you know, the diurnal light in these kind of Saturnian places. And I feel like the Capricorn episodes were really, really good. So yeah, I'm excited to get into this next iteration of the sun sign series. How has the recent astrology been for you? I'm like, what's even been going on? I know that last time you were on for the Lot of Fortune episode, we talked about like Mercury retrogrades being particularly impactful. I think we just got out of like, uh, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on like shadow periods and how much weight you put into them. I think we just got out of the post retrograde shadow like yesterday.
Yeah.
So how's it been?
Yeah, I think shadow periods are very real, but I also think we're constantly in a shadow period or a retrograde. Like if you take on whatever 3 weeks on the front end of Mercury's retrograde cycle and like 3 weeks on the back end, and the 3 weeks of the retrograde, and you add all of that up and times that by four. Like
Mm-hmm.
most of the year is spent in shadow or is spent in retrograde, or at least half of it, but it still feels relevant to me. Like I can notice a distinct shift of when Mercury does get out of shadow. It does feel like certain things are wrapping up, like that there has been a review of certain things. And then all of a sudden
Mm-hmm.
it's like, okay, now it's time to chart new territory, which is
Yeah.
always fun and exciting for me. So yeah, I'm happy that Mercury is finally moving forward as someone who is ruled by Mercury. And then, yeah, Pluto just moved into Aquarius, which is a big shift. We were kind of talking
Yeah.
about that before we jumped on here, and that feels pretty massive for me personally, because as we'll
Mm-hmm.
talk about, I've got a lot of Aquarius placements. So I feel like I've been sensing that impending, maybe not doom, but transit beginning. And
Mm-hmm.
it almost felt like to me, like Pluto was like pounding on the gates of my ninth house, like, let me in,
Mm-hmm.
let me in.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I'm
Do you
just
do
kind
you
of
feel doomful about it? Because I've been feeling quite hopeful, like hoping for the alleviation of the Capricorn house in my chart and like welcoming the ending of that. Although I know like, you know, people are posting on Twitter about like, you know, Pluto's going to move back into Capricorn later in the year, but I'm like, okay, we're going to have some time before that. You know, we're going to get like a real kind of, we got a taste in 2023, and we're going to get like kind of the real beginnings of Pluto and Aquarius now, even though we have that, retreat back into Capricorn.
Yeah, totally. I tweeted about that yesterday, and I was saying that first transit felt almost like a toe dip.
Hmm.
This one feels like we're jumping in head first, and then we have to
Yeah.
get out for some reason, and then we get back in and we're fully there. But
Hmm.
last time it just felt like we were almost like testing the waters, and now we're
Hmm.
in it. And so I'm definitely relieved to have Pluto out of my eighth. That's been a journey for the last 15
Hmm.
years. And so
Hmm.
I feel a lot of relief about that. I think, my Aquarius situation is my sun, my moon, and my chart ruler.
Hmm.
So it's not just any planets, it's the most personal planets. And so I think that there is a part of me that is a little, you know, um, I don't want to say fearful because that's not helpful, but a
Right.
little, weary of what
Hmm.
could come to pass. But I
Hmm.
am hopeful regarding the themes that I've seen coming up since Pluto's been like starting to move into there. That makes me feel a little bit more hopeful, but I don't know. I don't trust the outers, they're always gonna surprise you. And it's a
Hmm.
20-year transit, like, it's gonna bring some good and some bad, so
Right.
kind of just have to strap in and go for the ride, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely hear that. Um, and it's interesting too because it's not like, people talk about transit sometimes as if you go back to where you started, but I think the interesting things about transits is along with like the other kind of timing elements uh of your personal astrology, they really do like move the narrative forward in an irreversible way. So it's not like for you the eighth house things are just going to go back to where they were before this kind of long Pluto transit. It's like you have to deal with a new landscape. Um,
Yeah,
so
that's a
yeah.
great way of putting it. It feels like a very major transformation. I mean, it's 15 years, but there was a very consistent thread of what Pluto in my 8th house was of just dealing with other people's money and resources.
Mm,
Even, it started when I was in middle school or something.
hmm.
So that started out as watching my parents navigate that. And then that turned into me navigating that. And then
Hmm.
now I can see the way that some of that stuff is starting to wrap up. And that makes me really happy because eighth house stuff is never, well, maybe not never, but rarely fun. I think
Mm,
ninth house stuff has the capacity to be a lot more fun, especially when
yeah.
it's like transformation in the ninth house way, but it's more about
Mm,
the like Pluto moon stuff, but I've got a long time. I've got like 15 years before that happens. So
yeah.
see where I'm at when we get there.
Right. All right, Kira, can you offer us an introduction to yourself and your practice?
Sure. I'm Kira Ryberg. I'm a traditional Hellenistic inspired astrologer, writer, diviner, wannabe philosopher is usually my spiel. And I've started adding actual human onto that because it seems like sometimes people forget on the internet that we are actual people.
Very good
And
for Pluto and Aquarius to
yeah,
remember that
actual
we're
human. It is right on brand for that. And
because
yeah,
things might get a little you know, the
weird.
lines might get a little bit more blurred with Pluto
Yeah,
and Aquarius.
absolutely. It's gonna get weird, hopefully in exciting ways and not only terrifying ones.
Hmm.
And yeah, I've been practicing professionally since 2020. I'm certified in Hellenistic intellectual astrology through Chris Brennan. He's probably my primary teacher. I've also learned from Austin Coppock and Robert Schmidt, Demetra George, the greats, along
Hmm.
with lots of ancient astrologers and their surviving works, which have been a guiding light in my practice. And yeah, I think I'm just here to help people fall in love with themselves, fall in love with the cosmos and the connection between all of us and every sentient being in the world.
Hmm.
And that's really what I'm trying to do.
Amazing. Thank you for that, Kira. And I don't know why I'm asking this, but did you tell the story of like how you became an astrologer when you were on the podcast last time? Like I'm curious, like what led you to astrology and what led you to doing it professionally?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think we were really like a lot of fortune based. It was less
Hmm.
of like a
Very
let's talk
very
about
fate and free will
yeah,
focused.
a bit more of an intense conversation probably. Yeah, so I had a friend who was really into it and she was really big in tarot and she
Hmm.
wanted to actually ironically start a podcast
Oh,
and
cool.
she wanted me to do the astrology stuff, but I didn't know anything about astrology. So
Hmm.
I was like, I gotta learn or I have nothing to add.
Hmm.
And obviously that podcast does not exist anymore, but it was basically what kind of got me interested. It was what pulled me down the rabbit hole, and then I just never got out. It was a
Mm,
very rapid starting to just, "Oh, what are signs and planets?" and taking notes on everything and reading everything I can on every website, and then, "Oh, what's the astrology podcast?" and getting into that, and then realizing, "Oh, traditional astrology is different from modern astrology," and then just kind of going down that, taking Chris's course, and I didn't intend to become a professional astrologer. It happened to me, very fated, during a loosing of the bond, no less. And
mm,
I had a friend who was just asking me questions about her boyfriend's astrology at the time. She was like, what can you tell me about this? You know?
mhm,
So I was just rattling off the things that came to mind. And she was like, "You're really good at this." And I was just like, not, not really. Like I just kind
mhm.
of been doing it. And unbeknownst to me, she sends something in her group chat that's like, "I have a friend who's an astrologer. Does anybody want their chart read?" And I did not know she was doing that.
Mhm.
And then she comes back and says, "I have 2 people who want readings. You can just charge them $20, but I think you should do it."
Wow.
And I did those 2 readings. They recommended me to more people, and it just kind of spiraled from there into a whole full-blown career. Here we are.
Mhm. Wow. That's amazing. I'm just like thinking about your chart. Let me pull it up. I also want to say, um, so I just recently shared my chart publicly for the first time when I was on a podcast with Mackenzie McCormick for the Mars and Sag episode. And it feels like an honor to be on the other side now because like Mackenzie was like tearful when I was like, this is the first time I'm sharing my chart. And so it just feels cool to be able to, you have been like a public figure in the astrological space for a while. So it just feels cool to be sharing your chart right now.
I
And it's
pulled
kind of,
cards and they said to share it. So here
oh,
we are.
nice. There we go. Cool. So it's just funny that like the way that you got into astrology, if we think of astrology as like a ninth house thing, is by like going on a podcast and doing that publicly. And like you have the ruler of the ninth in the 10th, which is generally just like an indication for doing ninth house stuff professionally.
Yeah.
But that's just like a funny thing because I have not heard many other people getting into astrology in that way.
Yeah, it
Um,
was a really weird, probably too fast too, like if
mhm,
I feel like most people, I don't often tell this story because a lot of people think you need to study for 4 years before you can ever give a professional reading, and that just wasn't my journey, it wasn't my path, and I think I had shame about that for a while,
yeah.
like it made me less valid or something, Aquarius Sun things.
Mm,
But then I also have that, sextile from the Sun to Jupiter, which is one of the tightest aspects in my chart, and I've got Jupiter in the 7th house in Sagittarius, and to me that felt very much like my friend kind of pushing me off the ledge, which
yeah.
then kind of started my whole career. I would not be doing this probably professionally, at least I wouldn't have for a very long time if it wasn't for her just saying, "Here's clients." I did it
Right.
for you.
Yeah.
So yeah, it shows up in my chart in cool ways, I think.
Yeah. And for those people who are out there, because I feel like I have a kind of similar experience where I was like, oh, I think I want to do this professionally. And I kind of started, doing that as a pretty new student. And I feel like it's worked pretty well. But how did you feel like you were ready? Or for people who are maybe like, I want to do this professionally, but if they don't know if they're ready or not, like, what suggestions might you have for those people?
Yeah, I think for me, I started doing written reports. So I spent a lot of time on these. I
Mm-hmm.
was spending like 8 hours or more on a single report and charging people $20. It was a
Mm,
process of just getting comfortable with that, I think. And then even when I moved into doing live consultations, I would still write the reports and then I would have like my kind of guide with me,
yeah.
which now I don't really do that anymore, because it just takes way too much time and I don't need it anymore. But
Mm-hmm.
there was that process there of like it was slow. There was like a slow integration of like first I do the written ones, then I do written and live, and then I just move into live. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think it's about listening to yourself and what you feel comfortable with. And I think it was an astrology podcast episode where they just answered questions, how they used to do those
Mm-hmm.
with Austin and Kelly. And I think Kelly said one time, the minute that you can say something to someone about their chart that they don't know, that's when you have something to offer. And I was like,
Mm,
"Oh, well, I can do that. Like, I've got a lot more knowledge than the average person." And so
yeah.
I think as long as you're being honest and fair and telling me, like, I told everybody, I don't I'm just started. I'm not very,
Mhm.
I'm not a professional yet. I'm gonna be charging way less, and slowly building your way up from there, I think is a really good way to get the experience. Because I think you can read so many books, you can take so many courses, and you should, and that's a great thing to do to kind of get that, like, baseline level of knowledge down. But
Mhm.
there is just something that cannot be replicated about having a live face-to-face consultation and talking to people about their charts. You're gonna learn so much more than you're ever gonna learn in a book, and so I think you kind of have to have both, and on some ways for the right people, I think having that early on can be just a huge accelerator in how much you learn.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll also say, because I don't know if I've said this like on the podcast before, but for people that are interested in doing like a podcast, an astrological podcast, I like really want to encourage people to do that too, because I was just on a podcast with JM Hamadi talking about like astrology and podcasts. And
Cool.
so this is kind of like fresh in my mind. And I think that's going to be released in a few weeks, maybe after this episode, we release this episode. But
Awesome.
there's like, I think being in consultation feels, the kind of way we put it in the episode was like, it feels very mercurial for me in particular, like very technical and very structured. And I think that there is like this kind of Jupiterian lunar element of giving a consultation, like like a consulting astrologer can be akin to like a counselor, even though
Totally.
like for legal reasons they're not a counselor or a therapist or anything like that. But there's an element of like witnessing a person, being with them in solidarity, like being an emotional kind of support, and like framing that or having like this astrological structure. But doing an astrology podcast, and maybe because it's like um I feel like my role is different and I'm still kind of like discovering my own role in consultation versus like being a podcast host, like it feels like a different kind of role, at
Mhm.
least slightly. And it feels like but it feels like a really important kind of learning, and I think it helps other people learn by listening and hearing the embodied experience of knowledgeable astrologers. But there's like only so much I can do, like I'm doing like 2 episodes a month, sometimes a little bit more, and like that's it, and I'm covering this very specific topic, and that's all I'm doing. And so, yeah, I think I want to encourage other people, if they want to do like similar stuff, or whatever they want to do in terms of an astrology podcast, to like go for it, because it is also a kind of intensification of learning, that kind of can't be the only way. I feel like it can thing it's akin to is if you have like a really intense astrological community that you're kind of talking to all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the application, right? Like, instead of just
Hmm.
the sitting down and reading a book, it's applying what you know, whether it's you generating really thoughtful questions for your guests and, like, submerging yourself in that kind of world, or having a conversation with your Astro group chat and everybody kind of just speaking the same language, right? There's a way that you are now jumping into the application mode in the same way that you do in a consult, rather than just reading it off a page, which, don't get me wrong, I love my Astro books. I've got a whole bookcase behind me
Hmm.
of, like, astrology books. I just think it's important to do you need both pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. Yeah, for the people who are listening, I've had Kira's chart pulled up. It's Gemini rising with this kind of like little Aquarius stellium here in the ninth whole sign house, with the moon, Mercury, and the sun there in Aquarius. Um, yeah, so you're a very like ninth house kind of person, which I'm sure we'll get into. Um, and yeah, do you have anything else you want to kind of point out in terms of your chart at this moment?
I mean, I've got Mars opposing the Aquarius stellium in Leo, which might be helpful as we move throughout this, and then I've got both benefics in the 7th, which is the real nice part of my chart, I think.
Yeah, It's quite beautiful. Yeah. So your malefic out of Sect, which is kind of deemed like the most challenging planet, depending upon, other configurations, perhaps, or other kind of factors, perhaps that's opposing um, these Aquarius planets, perhaps like your moon, most particularly
Yeah.
because your moon is applying to it.
Hmm.
Um, and then, yeah, you have Saturn and Pisces in the 10th. Um, yeah, for Saturn Pisces people, do you feel like you've started your Saturn return
Oh yeah.
since Pisces is like
Oh yeah.
there, even though that you haven't had like the direct hit yet? You're going to have that later this year.
Yeah, I have it in like 2 months, I think. Yeah, it's going. We're in
Mm-hmm.
it. And I only get the one hit too. It comes back, I think, to like maybe 12 degrees and then stations direct and
Oh,
moves
okay.
forward. So I've kind of got the one and done Saturn return rather than the retrograde,
Mm-hmm.
thing that some people get where they get three passes. And so, yeah, I'm definitely fully in the Saturn return at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with Saturn being in the 10th and ruling the ninth and the 8th, perhaps your Saturn return might be more particularly about these kind of like this kind of the topics of this quadrant, or what have you, like, those shared resources you were talking about with Pluto and Capricorn earlier, and then the ninth house topics that we're going to probably touch on a lot today, and then 10th house of, like work and public presentation or what have you.
Yeah, definitely. That feels very on point for what it's like so far.
Hmm. Okay, and to kind of move on about the conversation about the sun, yeah, I'm just curious to hear about your relationship to the sun and like sun sign astrology in general, like before you became an astrologer. Like, did you relate to your horoscope when you like read it? Did you do that a lot? Did you identify heavily as an Aquarius?
Yeah, I think I did. I don't know if it's because it's just the stellium, but I
Mm-hmm.
always felt very Aquarian, even though I think a lot of sun sign astrology, especially the kind that I would read when I was, a kid, like in the magazines and stuff, was more based on Uranus as the ruler of Aquarius rather than
Mm,
Saturn, which I'm sure we're going to get into at some point throughout this episode. But I think I always felt, yeah, like a bit of the outcast or like that typical Aquarian vibe of just being like the weirdo or the kid who just doesn't feel like they fit in, like
mm-hmm.
other people do. And so I think I really related to my sun sign, and I've always really loved the sun. I think it's like very true that it's a form of remediation just to be in the sun for me. Like I need
Mm,
to get outside, and if I don't, then I can just feel like my life force draining at a rapid at a rapid rate. Like I thrive in the spring and the summer, and in the winter I get a little more, Saturnian, melancholic and things like
mm-hmm.
that. So I think that that all really shows up. Like I love the sun. Like, I really have like a strong relationship with it as a force in astronomy more than, like not necessarily just like the astrological significations, but even some of my primary work in astrology is around like the lot of spirit, which is the sun's law. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
in both ways, I feel very drawn to it as a presence. And I don't know if that's just subconscious remediation or something like that. I have like a sunflower on the back of my neck that I got when I was before I was ever into astrology and things like
Oh,
that.
wow.
So I feel like there was just these ways that I was always pulled to it,
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the term? So for people who aren't familiar with you, you live in France, and I'm curious what the term for sunflower is in French.
That's a good question. I
You
honestly
know?
don't.
Okay, because in
I don't.
Spanish it's girasol, which means sun turn, and it's interesting that sunflowers, like, all plants are responsive to the sun and will move to the sun, but in Spanish at least, the name is literally like turning to the sun.
Yeah, I feel like I do. Yeah, it's Turon Sol as well. So like turning to the sun as well. It's like,
Mm,
wait, that's sprung something. That sounds right.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, there's that, it's because my grandma had a huge sunflower field outside of her house when I was a kid, and I would go visit her, and we would
Mm,
just love to be in the sunflower field. And she has like pictures of me from when I was a kid. And so it was
hmm.
like a big thing,
Yeah.
in my
Did
childhood.
did you live close to your grandma?
No, I was in California and she was in Virginia, so I'd go spend like
Uh,
summers with my family in Virginia and go to the sunflower field.
oh, cool. So you were around sun a lot because, like, I just moved back to New York, so I've been feeling the very Saturnian Aquarian. It's been like 20 degrees this whole week, and I've been
Yeah.
like not moving as much as I need to, and like I was just walking my dog, and was the sun is shining today, and the sky is clear, and I'm like, okay,
I
okay,
feel better.
like getting the little bits that I can, and just appreciating like the warmth and the cold kind of.
Hmm.
Um, but growing up, like, I think growing up in California, where like I've spent time in California, yeah, you just don't have to deal with the winter in the same way. And then I spend a lot of time around in college and after college in Baltimore, which is a similar climate to
Hmm.
Virginia, and it's very humid and hot in the summer. Um,
Yeah.
so you
Very
were around the
different.
sun a lot.
Yeah, I mean, San Diego is kind of known for always being sunny, like the
Hmm.
coldest it gets is like 50 degrees. And so I was, yeah, kind of in a place where I was naturally remediating all of the time because I was just in
Hmm.
the sun.
Yeah.
And then I moved to France, and obviously it's a very different climate here. We still get summers, but you have all four seasons. And
Right.
so there was a big shift of, I remember I got here, I didn't even have like a winter coat. I was like, what do you
Mm.
mean? I was not prepared for like what a winter felt
Hmm.
like,
Hmm.
and so it was a big adaptation, but I think I do appreciate each season, but I do notice that my mood and general temperament changes a lot with each season. And I think that part of that is just because I'm lacking sunlight. I'm like
Hmm.
a little lizard. Like the second that it gets warm and sunny outside, I go out and I like get on a rock and try to work outside as much as possible and stuff
Uh-huh.
like that.
Yeah.
It feeds my life force for sure.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm the same way, and I feel like the remediation that I found here in New York in winter, and it took me a long time actually. Like it took me into adulthood to like figure this out, was just like not like the kind of heat that the sun can bring, but like cultivating warmth. And what that looked like for
Yeah.
me here was like just layering appropriately,
Hmm.
and like covering my skin from the cold. So like the other day I went out and it was very cold and very windy here. um I live by the ocean, so it gets very windy, and there are people who are like walking out with coats, but they like didn't have hats on and stuff, and I have like a thermal mask on, I have gloves, I have two
Yeah.
jackets on like,
Yeah.
but like that creates this kind of heat for me, where I don't go outside and like hate the fact that I'm outside. Like I go outside and it's just, I feel kind of neutrality about the cold. So I'm
Yeah.
curious what, like, how that transition was for you and how you kind of learned to live in a seasonal place.
Yeah, I mean, the transition was rough. I think the first year, I just really wasn't ready for it. And I was also I was au pairing. So I was, living with a
Mm,
family. It wasn't a
yeah.
great situation. Like the vibes weren't the best. And so, winter, you're feeling very caged in. And so I think I got a very Saturnian experience of that. And then over time now I, have a home with my husband, and I need a fire every night in the winter. Like, and
Mm,
if it were my choice, I would have a fire all day long and I would just sit by the
mm-hmm,
fire. I don't know if that's my Leo I see, but that to me is almost like my form of getting that warmth. And then I have a dog too, so I go out for a dog walk every day, and I think what you're saying is so true. Like you have to dress appropriately, which was a real learning experience for me because I came from
yeah.
California where it's just crop tops and sandals and shorts all the
Mm-hmm,
time. So I didn't understand, like you can't do that. You have to dress appropriately for the weather. Otherwise you're gonna get sick and get cold and
mm-hmm,
all of the things that you just kind of described. And so yeah, it was a big learning experience. But I think now I kind of appreciate having different seasons and different moments. And I think it feels a little like a little bit more like I'm in rhythm with nature, because in San
mm-hmm,
Diego, it almost just feels like you go from warm-ish to warm to hot to warmish to warm to hot. There's not
mm-hmm.
variation. And so, San Diego is kind of like the desert in a lot of ways if you're not too close to the beach. So it just has a different, very different climate.
Yeah. Yeah, there's an interesting thing there, I think, with seasonality and Saturn, and time, where my experience of living in California, like I lived in LA, and like you can go many, many days where it's just 70 and sunny every
Mhm.
day. And it warps time in a interesting way where
Yeah.
I think you can go, and I think this is maybe evident in like, I don't know if San Diego is like this, but um I would meet people in LA and they'd be like, "Oh, when did you get here?" And I'd be like, "4 years ago." And they'd be like, "Oh, you just got here. Like, welcome to LA." And I'd be like, "No, I've been here for 4 years. Like I've been
Yeah.
here for a long time." In New York, if you're here for 4 years, you're like almost an honorary New Yorker.
Yeah.
Like if you can make it that long, because it's can be so harsh here. Um, but there's an interesting like warping of time that happens, and I think there's something about seasonality, and like the coldness that comes in Saturn seasons, Capricorn season, and Aquarius season, that feels, like it brings this kind of different experience of time that I don't know if I can quite put my finger on, but feels very kind of visceral.
Yeah, like you go through the death of nature and, the days being extremely short. And of course, there's kind of that in, LA and San Diego as well, but not nearly to the same extent. Like you don't really watch the leaves turn colors.
Mm-hmm.
And so you don't have that kind of reckoning of like, oh, the year is coming to a close. Oh, it's slowly starting to get like, colder and colder. And then all of a sudden, I cannot go outside without a jacket and gloves and a beanie and all
Right.
of these things. And I think it kind of gives you that appreciation of the passing of time.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, like what you're describing in San Diego or California or Southern California more
Yeah.
specifically, you don't have that. So it kind of just feels very monotonous,
Mm-hmm.
rather than, yeah, like there's like this temporal quality to living in places that do get colder, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, sorry for saying California. NorCal people don't come for
Yeah.
me. I don't have the experience living up there. I'm sorry. Um,
No, like it definitely gets cold up here. I don't know what you're
there
talking
there were
about.
there were definitely times when I thought like San Francisco was NorCal, and people would be like, "No, like that's the Bay,"
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know.
The
So,
specificities of it all.
hmm um, cool. All right. Yeah. What is like the sun? Do you have any additional thoughts about what the sun means astrologically, beyond just like your kind of personal relationship with the sun as like this kind of astronomical being?
Yeah, I think the sun has a lot to do with our spirit. And I think that this is something that's gotten really warped in modern astrology, where we just say, like, the sun is the ego. And
Mm,
while there are egoic qualities to the sun, I think primarily it is your life force, it's your spirit.
hmm
It is, the thing that animates you. And so there is something that's very deeply personal about the sun in astrology. And I think we kind of have to make the sun cool again. Like it's like
hmm
we've kind of created this feeling where it's like, yeah, just like we really over focus it on like, oh, it's like this egocentric thing. Like the sun is all about having, all of the attention and all of this stuff. And it's like just I always say this to Leos in sessions where I'm like, if you don't give a baby attention, it dies. Like we all need
mm,
attention as humans. That's not a
yeah.
fault or something that's a problem with you if you need attention and care and someone to just
hmm
like shine some warmth on you. And so I think
hmm
we've kind of somehow like demonized the sun a little bit. And I wish that we would go back a little bit more to saying that it's actually really important and it is a true piece of who you are. And I think that's why sun sign astrology does work. That's why it hits. That's why it's the thing that is the bridge for so many people to learn more because there is something extremely resonant and true. And while we may have gone really far into, a part of that that's just not helpful with sun sign astrology. Like, not everything is going to be dependent on that. It's still incredibly important. And so, yeah, I think of it as being, crucial to your life force, your vitality, the thing that
hmm
energizes you. And it's a deeply personal part of the chart, I think.
Yeah, I sensed in you talking about, and like I relate to this, but you talking about becoming a professional astrologer, like maybe a hint of perfectionism. And so like I think for myself, like I can have big goals or like want to achieve kind of like big things, and that's maybe driven by like an unfortunate like inherited perfectionism. But like my goal for this series is really like my very humble goal for this series is to kind of like replace the sun in contemporary astrology, because I do feel like we my experience or my perception is that we are in a place where um you have like the modern astrologers maybe that prioritize the sun and sun sign astrology, and then you have more quote unquote traditional astrologers who de-emphasize it or like
Mhm.
almost reject it because it has been so kind of co-opted by modern astrologers, and like has like the newspaper horoscopes have these kind of like capitalistic connotations and like all of
Totally.
these things, and there's a rejection of that. But it is like we do live in a solar system, like the sun is incredibly important for our individual lives. And so how do we like put like how do we put that in its right place, like um and I don't know if I'll be able to do that, but that's at least the goal, because I do think that that's important. um
Yeah, I love that, and it is important, it's like, how do we strike the balance between the 2 of having us gone so far into one direction with sun sign astrology and, like you mentioned, like, newspaper columns, and now it's all, like, sun sign memes and all of this in
mhm,
the Instagram era, and then, the other side of it, which is like, "No, there's so many more interesting things in the chart to talk about than the sun." It's
mhm,
like, "Maybe, but the sun's also incredibly important as well," and so how do we kind of, yeah, find the in between that feels really, balanced. And I think I'm
mhm.
really excited. I don't know if you've seen this, but Meg Keen just launched a new offering on the sun and talking kind of like
Oh,
bringing it back to
cool.
this place that sounds like a lot like what we're talking about. And I was
Awesome.
really excited when I saw that someone was doing that because it feels like exactly what we need is to say, like, how is this really important? Like, how do you become sovereign in your own life? And how do you lean
Mhm.
into the parts of the sun that are so crucial for your being, without going all the way to the say, like, "This is my whole self," because it's a really
Yeah.
important integral part of it, but it's not the entire picture, and so I think we just have to hold space for both, so I'm excited that there's astrologers like you and astrologers like Meg who are starting to kind of reemphasize that part of the sun that's been missing for a little bit, I think, in traditional astrology.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Kara. I really appreciate that.
Of course.
And I just want to, shout out the Lot of Fortune episode that we did earlier last year. Like lots are so important in. I don't like this term traditional astrology because I'm like, what tradition are we talking about? But
Yeah.
pre-modern astrology, lots are typically very important, and like the perhaps the most important lots I know zodiacal releasing is like a big part of your practice, are the lot of fortune and the lot of spirit, and that basically is reliant upon the ascendant, the moon, and the sun, uh,
Mhm.
both of those lots. So those three places, I mean, it's not a mistake that people are like, what are your sun, moon, and rising? Because like those are in it, I think in addition to I think Kira, the other Kira, one of the other Kiras, because I know there's multiple Kiras in the astrological community. uh Kira Taborn is trying to like expand it to SMR
Chart ruler?
L. Yeah,
Or
like,
yeah.
and then like the ascendant ruler as well, because that's like really, really important, especially for like how the self manifests. Um, so anyway, yeah, it's just um, even within traditional astrology, it's kind of implied that the sun is quite important.
Yeah, absolutely, and, if anyone's engaged with my work at all, you probably know I can't shut up about the lot of spirit, so it's my favorite thing to talk about in a chart, and I wouldn't be able to do that if we didn't have the sun and the moon and the ascendant
Hmm.
and, things like that, so I think that to me shows your purpose in this life, like, what were you truly incarnated to do? Your lot of spirit is
Mm.
gonna speak to that, whether it's related to your profession or not, which I
Hmm.
think the 2 get conflated a lot in modern day society that your purpose is always gonna be your profession, or you should be striving to do your purpose for your profession, and, like, maybe, maybe
Hmm.
not, Not for
Yeah.
everybody, and I think, sometimes it's really nice to have something that speaks to just that purpose point, and so the lot of spirit and using the sun in that calculation is going to be so crucial to kind of getting to the core of, like I said, like what are you trying to do here? What is your daimon trying to do here? What is your spirit trying to achieve in this lifetime? And I
Mhm.
think those are some of the biggest questions that people can have in life, you know? So
Yeah.
it's important. We gotta talk about the sun.
Mhm. Yeah, and I know in your I've listened to your purpose and profession lecture, and you talk a lot about like really painting a picture of the place that the lot of spirit is, like what's the term, what's the decan, and like how has that decan been imagined. um and I guess for my own selfish reasons, I'm just curious because I also have the lot of spirit in the 12th house around the
Okay.
same degree. I'm just curious, like what you feel like, you have the lot of spirit in the 12th house at 22 Taurus. Like, what do you feel like? How does that house signification come in for you, when you're delineating that for yourself?
Yeah, it's so funny. It's the placement that I can delineate for everybody else, and it's super easy. And I have,
Hmm.
it's so funny. The closest I got to figuring out what it meant in my own chart was when I had another Gemini rising with their lot
Mm,
of spirit in Taurus in the 12th house. And I was like, oh, like this is how this shows up. I
hmm.
think a big part of it for me is Taurus, especially, like it's being ruled by Venus, it's a benefic place, right? So there can be different experiences of the 12th house. And I often
Hmm.
say there's, a 12th house that feels a lot more like forced exile. And there's a 12th house that
Yeah.
feels a lot more like the happy hermit. And for me,
Mm,
I'm like a happy hermit. I need
yeah.
to be alone a lot. That's a big part of how I do my work, how I approach things. And at the underlying of that with my Venus in the seventh, it's how I'm able to show up for connection. And so I think
Mm,
sometimes when you have your lot of spirit in the 12th house, it's about removing the shame you feel about needing solitude or space or alone time
hmm.
to get in touch with your soul and your spirit. And also means it's just not going to be as obvious, right? Like it's in the 12th,
Yeah.
you can't see it. And
Hmm.
so there are some like hidden mysteries that I think get associated with that space, as well as it being a place in the chart that we call metacosmios, which is in between worlds. And so
Hmm.
sometimes it's about navigating those in betweens. And I think for me, having the ruler in the seventh is navigating those in betweens with clients a lot of the time and trying to
Hmm.
find, almost like being the medium or being that go
Yeah.
between the cosmos and them. And so there's a big part of like kind of playing that role or that guide that I find shows up in those cadent houses quite a bit.
Hmm.
And then, just 12th house stuff. It's part of me. Can't get
Yeah.
away from it, even though I don't have placements there. If you have your lot of spirit in the 12th house, you might be a lot more 12th housey than you think.
Hmm. Yeah. In addition to like your south node and like your
Yeah.
nodal axis in that place too, which so another conversation. But
Yeah.
yeah, I guess I'm just curious because like the ninth house is so prominent in your chart, but you have this very important point in the 12th house, and both of these houses sometimes being associated with travel.
Mhm.
How you might differentiate that. And I guess I'm thinking about like Venus in the seventh of partnership ruling the lot of spirit 12th, that's like going far away to find a partner, is like what kind of comes to mind most obviously because I know you, and like
I'm
I
a
know that that's
stereotype.
I know that's your story. But like having all this stuff in your ninth could also, um,
Yeah.
ascendant ruler in the ninth, finding identity abroad, this kind of thing. Perhaps those can
Yeah.
be, that can be a both end, finding identity abroad and also finding partnership abroad. Doesn't Those aren't mutually exclusive. um
Yeah. Yeah. I think that they're both distinctly different things and both distinctly true. In my case, I think a big part of the Aquarian journey is being the outsider until you find the place or the people or the
mm,
circumstances where you can kind of feel sovereign. And for me, that
yeah.
was not in the United States. I just didn't feel at home there, I think. There was always a big
Hmm.
part of me that wanted to leave. And I think that's also just ninth house stuff. Like I love to travel. I love to experience other ways of doing life, other perspectives. But I think how I differentiate the ninth from the 12th in terms of travel is more like the 12th is immigration. Like it's the
Hmm.
fourth from the ninth. It's the process of being an outsider in a different place in a way that you don't get when you're only visiting, when you're a tourist, right? Like
Right.
there's a distinct difference there of when you're like, I'm just gonna go to Italy for 2 weeks and
Hmm.
eat all the pizza and the pasta and then going and like living in Italy. Those are very different things. One of them, you don't really need to know the language. The other one, you're probably gonna have to learn or you're gonna have a lot of trouble getting by. You
Yeah.
have to start, there's a separation there. And I think that there is an exile component to moving abroad that's very real,
Hmm.
especially in those first few years where you don't probably know anybody. You're very
Hmm.
alone. You have to start over. You don't speak the language. You don't have the customs.
Hmm.
It's very, you have to assimilate, right? And so
Right.
that process of assimilation, I think, is very difficult, even when it's chosen, even when it's
Hmm.
preferred. And then
Hmm.
we could also get into immigration that is forced or
Right.
immigration that's for, safety reasons, which is obviously going to add a whole other component to the 12th house that is not my happy hermit. I'm going to go move abroad. Like
Yeah.
my experience is very privileged in that way. And
Hmm.
I think they're different things, but I think that, yeah, there's a lot of isolation that
Yeah.
comes from moving to a new place where you don't speak the language, where you don't know anybody, which is what I did. I just kind of up and moved. I was like, you know what? Let's just go, let's go
Yeah.
try it out. Didn't have any friends there. I didn't, taken French, but I didn't really speak the language fluently. And then,
Hmm.
yeah, I did meet my partner. We did get married, and we also got married in my 12th house year and we eloped in Thailand and didn't invite anybody to our wedding. So it was a very
Wow.
12th house, ruled by Venus in the seventh kind of experience as well. So part of that's gotta play into it too.
Yeah. It's just interesting that in these Capricorn, Aquarius, Saturn Sun episodes, we've talked more about the 12th house. And for those that are unfamiliar with the joy schema, each planet joys in a certain place and Saturn joys in the 12th. So it feels fitting that we're talking more about that place. And for those that want to learn more about the 12th as it relates to finding refuge, I talk about that with Oscar in my last episode, or the first episode of the Capricorn Sun iteration, uh, and we have like a kind of really interesting, moving conversation about that. So I definitely suggest that if people are interested in talking more about or learning more about that. And I also feel like I relate a lot to. I just want to say, like, I relate a lot to that idea of like context really mattering in terms of how certain things land or how you perceive certain things when you are in a foreign country. Like
Hmm.
if someone looks at you weirdly, for example, when I lived in Belgium studying abroad in college, I went to Amsterdam and it was like the only place in Europe, this is just my experience, where I felt unsafe. Like
Interesting.
someone was riding their bike and they threw a beer can at me, and then like someone else tried to fight me on the street. It was very strange. Um, I just didn't go back. I was just like, all right, I won't come back here. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
not that big of a deal. I lived in Spain a few years later, and it was very common apparently for people to just stare at other people on the street.
Yes.
And I had like, as some people who have watched the podcast know, I had a large red beard. I don't look Spanish. Like people could tell that I was not from that place. And they
Mm.
stared at me on the street, and I found it to be. And going to Spain, I was like, I'm going to move to this place. Like I'm going to live in Spain. This is going to be my home now. And
Hmm.
I found that because of that context that I went into, uh, living there with, I found that to be very um, unsettling and upsetting. And
Yeah.
I
It's
ultimately
jarring.
left. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think there are, when you have like a 12th house context of like, I'm leaving my home and I'm going to this other place and I have to make it work, or I want to make it work. Some of those cultural differences uh, will be more evident than if you were just doing the ninth house thing of making the trip and leaving.
Yeah. And, you're going to have most of the time anyway, different planets ruling those houses. So your experience of being a
Mm-hmm.
tourist is going to be very different than your experience of being, like immigrating there or being an expat or, so there's, yeah, it's very jarring though, because no matter what you're going to have, you're going to come up against cultural norms that are just totally different than what you're used to. And I think this, really ties back in with just the narrative of Aquarius as the exile, and I think a
Mhm.
lot of Aquarians often have an experience where maybe they're not moving to a different country, but there is almost like a leaving that has to
Mhm.
happen in order to find themselves. And sometimes that can be a very painful process, perhaps more painful for those who have night charts and Saturn's their malefic contrary to sect.
Mhm.
But there's a process that's very distinct with Aquarius where they often feel like the black sheep of their family, or they feel like, like a outcast, or, in high school or whatever it might be. And those are usually the situations that cause someone to not feel rooted to where they come from. And it's like, well, why not leave? Why not try
Mhm.
something different? And so I think that that can show up a lot of times with Aquarius. And maybe that's where they get the, kind of that a lot of the significations that come with maybe like the more Uranus side of things, of like wanting to break free of cultural norms and stuff like that. I'm like, no, I think they just get sick of it and they want to leave and
Mhm.
try something new.
Mhm. Yeah, totally. I want to talk more about your thoughts on Aquarius. I just wanted to pull up Twitter really quickly because I felt moved last night to just ask people like, "Hey, I'm doing this recording with Kira and I'm recording with Cameron Allen tomorrow.
Oh, fun.
What questions do you have?" And someone answered an interesting question that I think, or asked an interesting question that aligned with that. So I'll just share my screen. Why was I summoned.png said, I think it'd be nice to get into why there are so many misconceptions. I said, can you tell me more about what misconceptions you see? They said the humanitarian being completely and totally emotionless, innovative, utopian building, also playing the role of the rebel. Some of these things can happen, sure, but I don't know why these extremes, Jesus complex ideas about them exist. So I feel like that kind of touches a little bit on what you were saying. Sam Reynolds has also been going on a bit of a tirade,
Aquarius.
a rampage on Aquarius placements,
Yeah.
saying that they're like, they get viewed as kind of utopian, um, but he doesn't see them that way. So I'm just, I think with those maybe 2 points as jumping off points, I'm interested to hear uh more about that and more about your perspective on this sign, and like why there does seem to be so many different ideas about what Aquarius is.
Yeah. Well, I think one of it is Uranus being the modern ruler and Saturn being the traditional ruler. I think a lot of it comes from that. And then I think another part that's really crucial is the temperament piece, which I think Ali Alomi talked about in his Aquarius episode that he did on his podcast as well, where
Mm-hmm.
Saturn is a cold, dry planet. Aquarius is a warm, kind of wet sign. So you have these contrarieties built in already,
Right.
right? Where we see someone who is going to deal with like Saturnian, maybe more like melancholic things, but then all of a sudden you get this like sanguine kind of temperament, right? So it's like
Mm-hmm.
someone who is both sociable and maybe a little bit more of a loner. And so I think that's where we get like the humanitarian kind of idea of
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, I'm here for the collective and I'm social, but also I want to be like locked into my, my cave or whatever. There's kind of
Yeah.
like a distance, I think, that shows up a lot of the time. And, we think of air as being a very movable element, then all of a sudden it's a fixed sign. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's like everywhere we look, we see these very opposing almost ideals of what it means to be an Aquarius. And I think Aquarians do hold a lot of contradictions within them because of this. I think they are social and also they're Saturnian. They need more alone time. They need, I love my friends, love to hang out, but also like I don't want to hang out more than like once a month. Like I'm just not.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
Mm-hmm.
just not that person.
Yeah.
And my friends know that about me. Like no one's hitting me up every week. Like let's hang out because they just know I'm not going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just part of who I am and how I approach relationship. And like,
Yeah.
but if you text me, I'm gonna reply, like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
I'm there, like I care about you, I love you, I want to take care of you, but I just can't be eternally present either. Like I kind of have
Yeah.
to have a bit of distance for myself. And so I think you see kind of, at least in my own, experience of being so Aquarian, is there's both sides of it where you do have that part of you. Like if I don't do anything for a week, I'll go crazy.
Mm.
Got to get out of the house. I got to be doing something, but not too much. There's like a
Right.
delicate
Right.
balance. And I think in Aquarius, you find that kind of need for balance. And I think the
Mm-hmm.
idealism that comes in Aquarius is oftentimes a product of consideration, right? Like this is the air element. There's a curiosity here, but it's fixed. So you
Mm-hmm.
want to go and you want to explore all the possibilities and try all the things, and then you want to define and kind of cultivate an opinion. And then once that's happened, it's very hard to change the opinion. I will be very honest when I say I think Aquarians are very stubborn people, myself included. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's because we've oftentimes taken the time to consider. And I think maybe this is where she's getting the God complex or Jesus complex thing is. It's like, well, no, but I've thought about it. Like I've
Mm-hmm.
taken the time to consider what the best possible way to do this is. You haven't even considered it. So of course, I'm going to be more right than you.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's a good way to be or the right way to be, but I think that can sometimes happen when we don't remain curious. We get too fixed in our opinions
Mm-hmm.
or too fixed in
Mm-hmm.
that process. And so you have to kind of move back into the air element of it all. And I think my, at least Gemini rising kind of helps balance that out a little bit for myself personally. But yeah, does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Totally. I mean, one of the things, so I guess I'll talk about the temperament thing first. I was reminded yesterday reading Ali Lomi's tweet thread about Aquarius that Aquarius is considered this hot, wet sign, which feels really interesting for me because within the Mediterranean context where astrology kind of arose, and within my context where I'm currently at, Aquarius season is a quite cold
Hmm.
time, but all it gets this kind of hot and wet thing because air signs within a certain temperament schema, and there are like a variety of temperament schemas. Some people would say that air signs are cold, and then in another schema they're given sanguine
Hmm.
qualities, so hot and wet, which is kind of like of the nature of Jupiter,
Hmm.
expanding and supportive of life. um, but there are like different temperament schemes, I guess. I just want to say, like, I recently heard Chris Brennan talking about this scheme that just gives one quality to each of the elements.
Mm.
I think it was on his like commentary on the Project Hindsight like interview thing that he did, and within that schema, air signs get a cold attribute, and fire signs get hot rather than hot and dry,
Mm.
um, and etc. So I just want to kind of point that out. And I also feel like this is kind of something I was relating to. I was reading Channy Nicholas's like Aquarius season post earlier today,
Hmm.
and I related especially to this thing. It said like she had welcome to Aquarius season and like all of these kind of statements. And one of the statements is humanity forward, but leave me alone. And I have Venus in Aquarius ruling my MC and doing a lot of work with the planets that I have in my first house as well. And I really relate to this in
Hmm.
an interesting way. And I think it does kind of embody that kind of Jupiterian sanguine quality of air signs, but also the Saturnian, like curmudgeonly, like leave me alone. Like things are more almost important as ideals than they
Yeah.
are in the lived reality. And I think for me, the thing I relate to, I also have Venus, in addition to ruling my 11th and my MC, she rules my sixth, the house of like pets,
Mm.
um, or certain kinds of animals. And I was vegan for 10 years. I'm no longer vegan for health reasons, but I was vegan for 10 years, and people would be like, oh, do you really like animals? And I'd be like, I don't particularly like, I'm not a person who like sees a dog on a street and like melts like some people do. Like, yeah, I like animals. I have a dog. I love cats. Um, which are, it's funny because they're like typically given
Saturnian.
Saturnian rulership. But like I believe more in the idea that animals shouldn't suffer needlessly.
Mm. Hmm.
That's the thing that's important because and then it's like people. It's like, yeah, like I believe in human rights, but I don't love all people. Like I don't want to hang out with everybody. And that's definitely changed a lot over time. But it's just interesting, like how there can be this gap between what's believed and what's what the desired embodied lived experience is. Um, so that's really interesting. And then the other thing I just want to say before I forget, it's interesting how for all mutable risings, their ninth house is a fixed sign.
Mhm.
So like I think about that a lot, being a Sag rising with Leo as my ninth whole sign house, with the sun ruling that, the planet that's perhaps like the most consistent.
Yeah.
Um, and there's this tension between like changeable identity, perhaps, depending on where your ascendant ruler is placed. Maybe you don't relate to that as much because you have Mercury ruling your Gemini ascendant in a fixed sign. But like I have this cardinal Jupiter in Cancer. And so there's this idea of like many iterations, like many
Mhm.
new selves. But like the underlying structure of belief, if we think about that as the ninth house, is quite consistent. Like my
Yeah.
beliefs don't change, my values and virtue, like the things I think are virtuous, they don't really change. Um, but like I have many iterations of myself, and that's an interesting kind of tension, I think.
Yeah, I love that. That's really interesting. And I feel very similarly, like, as I'm the classic Gemini rising. It's like, okay, it's time for my personal rebrand, like once per year, like I gotta gotta change it up. But then if I think about who I am at my core, it's very similar to who I was as a kid, especially like the things I believe, the values I hold, the things that I think are important to fight for in the world, like those humanitarian causes and things like that. I was the fifth grader writing papers on like why people should have like gay people should be allowed to get married and things like that, and like
Mm,
those things don't change. Like there's always been a focus for me on equality and justice, and like just let people live, let people be live their lives. And I think that there's a huge element of that. Maybe it also comes from a little bit of like Aquarius being like a humane sign, where it's like we're focused on the humanity element of like we want everyone to just do what they want to do because we want to do what we want to do, And I don't
mm-hmm.
want people to judge me or get
Hard
mad at me for
relate.
being me. And I don't want to get, I don't feel like I'm going to get mad or judge anybody for being them. Like, just do you, and I'm going to do me. And I think that those two things can peacefully coexist with I'll be social sometimes and also like, please, please leave me alone, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, I think the thing too, if we think about Aquarius as like opposite Leo and opposite like this home of the sun, I think about Aquarius as like the view from the outer edge.
Yes.
And I think maybe like the multiplicity or like these kinds of like varied um perceptions of Aquarius might be for that reason, because like the view from the center, if we think of the sun as the center, is limited. It can only see so far, perhaps. But if you're standing on a mountaintop at the edge of a city, you can
Hmm.
see the whole city. Maybe you can't see it in detail. You can't see the faces of the people walking around, but you have another perspective, which is equally valid or perhaps more valuable in
Yeah.
certain circumstances.
Yeah, I talk about that with clients a lot with people who have Aquarius placements because it is the unique perspective of being the outsider that allows you to see the structure of the whole versus when
Mm-hmm.
you are the sun, you are just you. Like there's no consideration almost of the
Mm-hmm.
structure of the whole because it just is what it is, and you're at the center of it and you can't, like you said, there's not a removal of perspective from where you're currently situated. Just with like Aquarius's, it's kind of hard to be imagining like what it would be like to be in the center. You could think about it, but it's a
Mm-hmm.
concept. It's not your reality. And the
Right.
reality for Aquarians is that you are on the outside. And
Mm-hmm.
that's not a bad thing. Sometimes that's really necessary. And I think that's why sometimes Aquarians have like that nature about them that is a little bit more of like, no, but I can see things from a different point of view. And perhaps the view that is a bit more collective focused
Mm-hmm.
and not self focused. And I don't say that with any type of judgment. We need both.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah, and I think when an Aquarius placement, or perhaps just like Saturnian in general, when they do find themselves the center of attention, like that experience can be very uncomfortable. And I think about my own sun in Capricorn and like creating this podcast, even like this kind of, in retrospect, pretty small visibility. um it was incredibly, like, I was so like uncomfortable and scared about the idea of like putting my voice and my image out into the world and like being increasing
Perceived.
in prominent, yeah, being
Yeah.
perceived, absolutely. And so like I had to look to people like, like Ari Felix comes to mind, someone who's like
Yeah.
very solar and like very much embodies their individuality, not to, say
And
something that's
radically
like,
themselves. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And like, I thought about them a lot when I was launching this, because I was like, um, I needed that kind of example of someone who was solar and,
Hmm.
stepped forth and shined in the world, um, in like a powerful way. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. That's so true. I think, especially what you're saying there, it really reminds me of my like premier lesson in detriment happened to me last Norwalk. And I was spending a lot of time with Daniel Norman, Daniel the Lion on, social
Our
media
friend
sites.
Daniel. Yeah.
Yes, love Daniel. Daniel, I think that they've posted their chart, so I'm sure it's fine to say this, but they have a Leo sun in the 10th house. I have an Aquarius sun on the midheaven, and they just light up every single room they walk in. Like they have a warmth, a glow. They can
Hmm.
talk to anybody, they can schmooze, they can charm. It's like, it's beautiful to watch. It really is. And I was just sitting there like, how do you do this? Like I don't
Hmm.
understand. And I think people oftentimes think because maybe my son is on the midheaven, that I'm like that,
Hmm.
and especially like I put myself out there on social media and stuff like that, but there's distance.
Yeah.
And like the distance is so key. Like I can't do that in person. I'm a very like actually very awkward and uncomfortable person until I know you. I tend to just
Mm.
like stick with the people I know because I need that like comfort zone. And when people come up to me and just start talking to me, I'm like,
Yeah.
I get really nervous. And I was sitting there and it just made me understand detriment so much better, where I was just like, it's not that I can't do the things that a domiciled sun can do. It's just that it feels wholly like contrary to my nature to force myself to do
Hmm.
this. I have to force myself to do it
Yeah.
rather than it just coming naturally. That doesn't mean I can't do it. That doesn't mean I can't do it well, but I have to work at it in a way
Hmm.
that I don't know, maybe Daniel feels like they have to do. I don't think they do. And I say that
Mm.
as someone who's quite good friends with Daniel.
Yeah.
But, they're just, it's natural. They just can
Hmm.
walk into a room and it's there, it's accessible. And for me, it's like, gotta have like a pep talk with myself before I go
Right.
into a place like that, where it's like, okay, you're going to talk to people and it's going to be a lot. And I feel really overwhelmed and I want to run away. And it's just not the same
Hmm.
feeling of the experience, if that makes sense.
Totally. I'm just thinking about my experience at Norwalk. I wasn't even there as like an astrology student or like a prominent person. Like I was there supporting my then partner who was speaking there. And
Mm.
even then, like I was like, I need to go back to the hotel room and like lay in bed and like play video games and like just not think for a little while and be alone. And so
Hmm.
I do think it's like, yeah, I relate a lot as like being an introvert. And that doesn't, I think that there's been a lot of talk about introversion over the past few years, like, that the book Quiet that came out. And it really does feel kind of like where you, for me, like where I get my energy from. The shyness that I've experienced in my life is separate from introversion, like,
Mm.
but like if I'm around people for too long, like I literally feel like I lose my center
Hmm.
and it's like hard to connect with myself. And I need to be alone to like reconnect with my body and reconnect with like what feels like my center. And so, yeah, it's like it's not that I can't do it. It's not that, um but like it's like what's the cost and like what needs to be done to come back to like a place of neutrality, like get back to zero. Whereas,
Yeah.
someone who's more extroverted, or perhaps like the Leo sun, they're just like getting energy from those interactions
Hmm.
rather than having it be like something that kind of feels like it is depleting
Yeah, it fuels their
energetically.
fire rather than draining it. And so much of what you
Hmm.
said, I think, is just the 12th house, a lot of spirit things too, right?
Hmm.
Like that need to kind of separate yourself and come back to center. I know after Norwalk, and I had seen some friends prior, so I had spent maybe like 10 days without being alone for more than 30 minutes. And I went and I was going to go see family after. I fell asleep at the dinner table. I was so exhausted and drained. And it's not like I wasn't sleeping. I wasn't up partying all night at Norwalk. Like it wasn't really like that at the last one. But it was just something about having to be on all of the time that was incredibly draining. And I think for my, Aquarius placements, like I just have to have a bit of, yeah, space, distance to be my little introverted self so I can go do the extroverted things. But
Hmm.
when you have to do them for an extended period of time, I think it's harder to be consistent with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and speaking of beautiful visages, and Daniel, I was inspired very much by Daniel's, we were talking about this before we started recording,
Yeah.
video setup, because they're launching a podcast. They released a little teaser for that, and their video setup was so nice, and makes me want to kind of step up my game for this podcast. But for any of you that have not checked that out, I'll link it in the show notes, but go check out Daniel's new podcast. What
What
time
time
it
is
is?
it? What time is
What
it?
time is it? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, it's
Great
just such a
name
cool
too.
concept. Yeah, it's great. They're just going to answer questions basically. So
Hmm.
it's so nice for people who are learning or who want to dive more into a specific subject, want the opinion of another astrologer. I feel like it's such an incredible format because we don't have anyone just kind of doing this question and answer thing, but there's so many people with questions.
Right,
Half of a Twitter reply thread is just like, what does this mean for me? What
right.
about this? And so it's like, well, now you have a place where you can go ask your questions and get
Hmm.
really thoughtful answers. Like Daniel is a genius. I don't think anyone knows how much they read and just they're so knowledgeable in so many things. I rave about Daniel. Love them.
Hmm.
See,
Yeah,
like the Leos, like you can't help but just be like, they're incredible,
yeah,
And I think even being around Leos to me feels like a solar remediation. I'm like, oh,
totally. There's a
your
warmth
glow.
that comes from them that,
Yeah.
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 Um, yeah, and I also just wanted to say, to kind of, I think people talk about detriment. I just want to kind of hopefully maybe expand this concept a little bit. But when I had Gray on this podcast talking about the moon and temperament, he was nice enough to share with me the lecture that he did at Norwalk 2023, about what's commonly known as detriment, which is a planet opposite the sign and house that it rules in a chart. Um, and his kind of contention is that the term detriment doesn't exist until, like it starts popping up in the 7th century, and the word is mistranslated and it kind of means opposite or contrary. And then he talks about how, in an astrology podcast episode, Ben Dykes and Chris are kind of talking about, like what this term should be. And Ben Dykes puts forth the term inversion, which Gray
Mm,
kind of prefers. Chris puts forth the term antithesis, like the antithesis of the
right.
synthesis, which is the place that, the planet rules. But antithesis does have kind of negative connotations. And so his main kind of, I'm still watching the lecture, but his main kind of idea is that, unlike fall, what we've called detriment is not really like the planet being weak, or not having resources, but it's more just like the planet being opposite that sign that it rules, and oppositions are harsh aspects that can bring tension. Um, So I'm just interested if you have any additional thoughts on that. The thought that kind of came up for me was that some of these kind of inversions could be, more or less challenging if you have like
Hmm.
Mars if you have a Scorpio ascendant and Mars in Taurus, maybe that's more difficult, because Mars is a malefic, or, you know, Saturn in Aquarius, you know, Saturn in Cancer ruling a Capricorn ascendant, something like that.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, like a sun opposition isn't necessarily like the worst thing, or a benefic opposition could be a good aspect. It's better than no aspect at all, perhaps.
Mhm.
So just interested in hearing your thoughts.
Yeah, I think it comes down to that planet feeling uncomfortable. Like, I think the best way to think about it is just imagine that planet in that place. So, the one that I often use for Mars, for example, it's like you're putting the god of war and then you put him in Taurus in this like gorgeous flower field, and Mars is like here to like chop shit down and like go to war. It's like, what am I
Mm-hmm.
supposed to do here? Like, what, like, I'm not built for this. And I think
Yeah.
that's how it feels. Is like, I'm not built for this. That doesn't mean Mars can't learn how to, well, respectfully take a chill pill and like hang out. I'm sure Mars can,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't feel natural. Mars doesn't want to sit down and hang out and have a picnic.
Mm-hmm.
Mars wants to go do shit.
Right.
And so I think it just creates this feeling of like, yeah, uncomfortability, or like, this is not my natural state. So I have to adapt.
Mm-hmm.
Adaptation is certainly possible and necessary. Like, I think, detriment planets or antithesis or inversion, whatever we want to say, they do learn to adapt. They get quite good at adapting, and
Mm-hmm.
they can hide the fact that they're adapting better and better with time and experience. But they're still adapting. It's still going
Mm-hmm.
to feel uncomfortable. I don't think that feeling ever goes wholly away, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And I also just want to give a shout out again to Kira Taborn, because I did this panel, this chart rulership panel with her, and we both are Jupiter ruled, but I have Jupiter exalted in Cancer, and she has Jupiter in quote unquote detriment in
In Virgo,
Virgo.
yeah.
And, I think in particular, if your ascendant ruler is in detriment, there is this real like kind of like preoccupation, or like thinking about the other, because the planet's in the seventh house. And I just want to kind of plug that. I just want to plug that panel that Catherine hosted, because I thought it was really, really informative, getting a different perspective on like this kind of similar risings, the same planetary ruler, but in a very different condition.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it can also just highlight where we might take things for granted sometimes with planets that are in domicile, not realize how easily that thing does come to us. Where with planets that are in detriment, like, they have to work for it a little bit more. That doesn't mean they can't get there, doesn't mean they're not resourced. They got to
Mm-hmm.
put the effort in. And I
Yeah.
think that effort becomes even like, a superpower or appreciated over time, where it can kind of become this thing where it's like, oh, I'm glad that I had to, had that experience, because it gives me a different perspective. That's often at least how I feel with my Aquarius sun. And
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes with domiciled planets, like my Jupiter in Sag, I don't know what it's like to not run on faith and optimism and just believe that
Uh-huh.
everything's going to be okay.
Yeah.
Like, there is this Saturnian part of me that balances out. My Saturn's in a Jupiter ruled sign. So I know that I come from a place that is inherently more glass half full than glass half
Mm-hmm.
empty.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes I think when we consider like the detriment schema and things like that, it can also just help us to understand where we might just benefit from certain things that, yeah, we don't even know how much that matters, or how powerful that gift can be when you're not working for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That's beautifully put. Um, yeah, so I just want to give a plug for one of your lectures that I found. It was the first lecture of yours that I watched, which was your ninth house lecture,
Oh,
which I found
thanks.
so like informative, and like made me think about like house aspects in a way that I hadn't really considered before. Like earlier we kind of talked about this square between the ninth and the 12th, which can be a tense thing. And you kind of go through all of the aspects in that lecture. And so you have like Aquarius as your ninth whole sign house, And I'm just curious that, again, with the joy schema, that means that your sun is joying in that house. And I'm just curious how you feel like the sun being in that place in the sky affects your experience of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the house significations come a lot from the joy schema as well. So when a planet is in its joy, it's just naturally capable of taking on the tasks there because the task aligned with its essential nature. It can feel
Hmm.
uncomfortable doing them if it's in detriment, like in my case, but it's kind of like, yeah, this is what we're here for. This is what we're supposed to do. Like people used to ask me when I was in like high school or middle school, like what I wanted to be when I grew up. And
Hmm.
I always think this is so funny now that I know my chart. I'd say, I want to be a modern day philosopher. Like, I just want to sit around and I want to think about shit and I want to tell people my opinions and I want to somehow make money off of this. And I just want to think about the world all of the time. That's what I want
Hmm.
to do. Which
Hmm.
obviously, like at the time, I was like, there's no job that I can have. And now I kind of get to do that. I
Yeah,
consult and
you
things like
do.
that. But
Yeah.
that's basically my job now. And so I think it was always there, and I think that sun was just always contemplative. And like I always wanted to learn and explore. And those ninth house things that are so crucial to, a person's pathway to self discovery, which is kind of like the, title of that lecture, is I think a lot of what we're doing in the ninth house is finding ourselves. We find
Hmm.
ourselves when we travel, when we engage in different, religious or spiritual traditions, those that are different from our own. We learn what we value about our own traditions and belief systems by
Hmm.
experiencing something that is outside of ourselves. And when you go to university, it's usually the first time where people are like, what do you want to do? What do you want to learn? Up until that point, it's all been directed by a greater organized system. And now finally you have a little bit of say. You get to choose what you major in.
Hmm.
You're separating from your parents for the first time for a lot of people. And so there is kind of this pathway to self-discovery that we find in the ninth house. And I think I've just been on that pathway maybe a little bit longer
Hmm.
than some people, like constantly engaging with those themes and ideas. And I remember in middle school, like my favorite lesson was like the religion lesson where we just learned about all the different religions. And there's
Hmm.
always been that part of me that just felt very intrigued by belief and like
Hmm.
what people believe in. And that was before I was ever remotely had any kind of belief in a higher power or anything like that. It was just like, wow, this is really important. People really seem to
Hmm.
care about this. We go to wars for the entirety of humanity over this stuff. Like,
Hmm.
it's important, and why wouldn't we want to study and learn about this thing that is so crucial and critical to the way people do life, to the way our governments are shaped? There's so many
Hmm.
things that kind of rest and rely on this. It just feels so crucial and integral to human nature. Like, why wouldn't we want to study that? And so my son, I think, has just always been wrapped up in those ninth house topics.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. You remind me that, not to go off on a tangent, but I actually have it right here, Abu Mashar's Book of Religions, where it's like him laying out the system of world astrology, which revolves a lot around Saturn Jupiter conjunctions.
Mhm.
But he talks about the role that kind of each of the planets play in society, and Saturn is the planet of religion, and we have and Jupiter is the planet of law. And the reason that the Saturn Jupiter conjunctions are so important is because uh, religion like sets the stage for law, and law reinforces religion. And the next outer planet, Mars, is the planet that makes sure that the laws are carried
Enforces.
out, yeah, by
Mhm.
via going to war, which determines dynasties and what have you. And so that's just, a really interesting kind of thought, how that's uh those kinds of thoughts were active for you kind of like before becoming a student of astrology. And it's interesting to think about the ninth house as also a planet, or I'm sorry, a place of law as well as religion, because
Mhm.
I think it's also, and again, you talk about like the cadence, the cadency, but the nice aspect between the ninth and the first. And I think that that's kind of embodied in this fact that law is a limit to self. Like
Mm,
law limits what we can uh, legally do within a society, and the things that we do perhaps to some degree determine who we are. But most of us don't like fret over that fact that like
yeah.
we shouldn't steal or murder or or things like that. We're just like, it's not like a, doesn't feel like a constraint, but there is this kind of legal constraint that hangs over all of us, and we live within legal frameworks. And so it's just interesting to kind of think about that, I think. um
Yeah.
what did you major in college? I'm curious.
I started majoring in history,
Okay.
so that's funny.
Hmm.
And then I dropped out and moved abroad
Hmm.
and came here, and then I kind of got caught up in, oh, I should probably just do something that's gonna actually be able to pay my bills because what am I gonna do with a history degree?
Yeah.
Even though that was what I was passionate about, that's why I majored in history. I have a minor in it now, but it was just the thing where I was like, that's what I want to study. And so
Hmm.
I wanted to spend my time learning about, which I didn't know in our capitalist society is not the way that you should approach college.
Yeah, I
Or
didn't know
maybe
that
perhaps
either.
it is actually the way that we should approach it, but it's not the way that we approach it.
Hmm.
And so then I ended up getting my degree in communications and social media, like digital marketing and things like that, which, to
Okay.
be fair, it all helps. It all
Yeah.
helps what I'm doing now.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think the history was the first and real calling that I wanted to. I was like, I'll be a history teacher or something like
Hmm.
that.
Yeah. Yeah, I studied philosophy for similar reasons because I was
There we
like, this
go.
is the only thing that really feels stimulating enough to me,
To
interesting
go
enough to
sit in a
me
classroom.
to go do, yeah, to like kind of commit to.
Yeah,
But I was also a global studies major, so I had that history. There was like a history component as well, a world history
hmm,
component. Um,
love that.
Interestingly enough, yeah.
Yeah,
Maybe one day I'll be a world astrologer. We'll
I'm
see.
sure I see it for you.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about your Saturn placement before we wrap up. How do you feel like that, you talked about Saturn in the 10th in Pisces. How does that kind of play into those kind of Saturnian houses in your chart and how they manifest?
Yeah, I think Saturn, well, anywhere that it's angular, prominent, conjunct to personal placement or something like that, feels like the weight of expectation, maybe
Mm,
that like perfectionist quality that we talked about earlier. To me, Saturn in the 10th feels very much like this pressure, to be make sure I'm always saying the right thing and, coming off the right way. And I never want to offend anybody. I worry incessantly about my work,
mm,
to the degree of like, I oftentimes will wake up at like 3 in the morning and be like, what did I say in that lecture like 3 months ago? And was that right?
mm-hmm,
Like I'll just like wonder if my source was right or if I said the wrong thing, which like it's out, it's done. Like
mm-hmm,
move on. You know what I mean?
mm-hmm,
Like if you said the wrong thing, you said the wrong thing. And actually listening to Robert Schmidt's lectures was one of the things that was so helpful for me with this because this man would just change his mind constantly and be
mm, yeah.
totally okay with it. He'd be like, "Oh yeah, I know I said in a lecture before that this is what I think, but actually now I think this." And no worries.
Mm-hmm,
I have that worry very, very strongly within myself that
mm-hmm,
if I say something, I want to make sure I'm saying it in a way that I can back up and support and that I have like the facts and the data and all those things. And so I think, yeah, Saturn in the 10th to me feels like this really strong pressure to make sure that if I'm presenting myself as an authority on a subject, that I'm well researched, that I have my information, that I'm presenting in a way that's clear and comprehensive.
mm-hmm,
But it also does feel stressful. It feels like pressure.
yeah.
I think sometimes feels very isolating or alienating. Like on the one hand, I'm lucky to have a lot of incredible friends in the astrology community, who
Mm-hmm,
I feel so connected to and so like lucky to have them. But on the other side, I'm like, I kind of had to do this all by myself, Like I feel like
mm,
there was like an alone factor where it was just me in my room with my little laptop trying to build a career,
mm-hmm,
and it felt like, I don't have coworkers, I don't have a boss. Like there is this isolating element, I think,
yeah.
to having Saturn in the 10th where it just feels like you kind of have to make it happen for yourself. if
Hmm.
that makes sense.
Totally. I mean, I think beyond your personal experience, that's definitely something I see with astrologers in particular. It's something I experience like doing this podcast, even like, I've talked about like I'm sitting in my room, I do my
Hmm.
editing, I put it out in the world. Sometimes I get feedback, sometimes I just see how many people have watched it and listened to it, and I'm like, okay, cool, the numbers going up. I hope that sounds like a good seems like a good thing. But like there is a detachment in a sense, and I think I've seen professional astrologers too. It's like work from their office at home, and
Hmm.
it's them, and they talk about like going to things like Norwalk or conferences and like why those are so important, because it's like the one time of year or what have you when they get to like come together with their colleagues or their friends, to kind of like be amongst other astrologers, because they're not going into like the astrology office every
Yeah,
day with the other astrologers doing
totally.
which maybe there's some kind of market there for, especially in a city like New York. I don't know how many people there are in Paris, but there's like probably enough astrologers here that we could rent an office and work
Totally.
together and do something like that. But
Yeah.
a lot of it is, yeah, this kind of, working in isolation and working kind of alone to build something, which feels very Saturnian.
Hmm. Yeah, that's why
But like,
the astrology group chat, you got to have one. It's to me, those
right.
are my coworkers,
Hmm.
to have people that you can kind of chat with and be like, hey, what do you think about this? Or, have just like water cooler chat, so to speak. I
Yeah.
think otherwise it really feels very Saturnian, which could get lonely sometimes. I think, especially if you don't have like a big consulting practice. Like I feel lucky enough that like I meet with people very regularly, like I
Hmm.
consult 4 days a week. I'm seeing 2 to 3 people on those days. So like I'm also kind of constantly interacting with people.
Yeah.
But then it's like, the Zoom ends and I'm back in
Hmm.
my office
Yeah.
by myself, just like writing a blog post or,
Hmm.
working on a lecture or something like that. So there's a very solitary component, I think, to my career. And I don't
Hmm.
live like close to any astrologers besides one person, Eloise. And we don't even like, she's always in a new country. So we
Oh, okay.
briefly sometimes will live in the same city. But other than that, I don't have like even friends that I could go meet up with that are
Hmm.
close by. So it just feels like, yeah, kind of doing it alone in my room.
Yeah. Yeah, and I will say, like, I do want to acknowledge that I'm privileged. Like 2 times a month, I get to have these kind of in-depth conversations with very thoughtful, like talented astrologers, and not everybody even gets that. Like, so, and if I can think up new ideas for episodes, I can have as many conversations as I really want. So, I do kind of acknowledge that I have some kind of privilege in that regard.
Yeah,
Um,
me as well, for sure.
yeah, which I'm definitely very grateful for. Amazing. Are there any aspects that your son makes that you think would be important to discuss?
Well, my sun is in conjunction with Mercury. My
Hmm.
Mercury's combust and retrograde, so moving towards the sun. And that feels very just central to everything I do. I'm an astrologer. I would associate Mercury with divination. I'm a writer. I would associate Mercury with writing and
Hmm.
communication. Even just like technology or like social media and that being a big part of like how I present my information and my teachings and things like
Hmm.
that. So I feel like there is a really big element of that, especially since I'm a Gemini rising. Like it's like these two
Right.
parts of my chart are kind of
That's you.
inseparable.
That's like
Yeah.
the avatar for you. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so it kind of feels like inseparable to who I am. And then my son also has like an overcoming sextile from Jupiter within 1 degree. It's separating, but it feels pretty prominent. And I think there's a hope and like an optimism that Jupiter gives my son that does help with the Saturnian sides of things that we've discussed in this
Hmm.
episode, where I don't even think like I did, like everyone's on Twitter these days, like what vibe am I? Like what planet am I? Saturn for me got like 10%. Like no one said
Oh,
Saturn. And
interesting.
and I think I'm so Saturnian. People will probably think I'm a lot more Saturnian after they hear this podcast. But
Mm.
that's not how I come off. I think I come off as very Jupiter, very Mercury, maybe
Yeah.
Venus, I don't know, but
Mm-hmm.
there's that element there that I think that sextile from Jupiter does help me appear with like my sun on the midheaven, very like positive and like joyous and things like that. And then
Mm-hmm.
people get to know me and they know that I'm really sarcastic and like
Mm-hmm.
I have this like completely other side to me that I think a lot of people just don't get from my online persona, so to
Right.
speak. And so,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think that that sextile is really powerful for helping me just be like a bit more like glass half full, but also for the way that people see me generally.
Mm-hmm. What won out in the poll?
It was an exact tie between Jupiter and Venus, which is shocking to me. I
Wow.
think it's just because I'm in a Venus
That's
year. Like
okay.
I don't think I'm a Venus person, which
Mm.
everyone else apparently disagrees. This is the first year I feel like I've gotten into Venus. Like she just my out of sec benefic. She's in Jupiter's sign. Jupiter's super strong. So I just feel like, sorry, girly. I just don't give her as much attention as I should, but
Mm-hmm.
apparently that's not the public perception.
Yeah, I'm checking my poll right now to see because I posted this too. 126 votes, 45% Jupiter, 31% Mercury.
I think I said moon for you.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, you give me like lunar, like thoughtful kind of vibe. I don't know if it's also just because you have a podcast about the moon. Like I was
Yeah.
wondering how much this played into people's votes, where if like they have something in their like title or something like that that we just tend to associate with them, even
Mm-hmm.
subconsciously, how that
Mm-hmm.
impacts the way that we vote.
Yeah. Yeah, the moon got nearly 18%. So the
Okay, I'm not
next,
the only one.
yeah, and I do have the moon in the first. I have Mars in the first. Mars only got 5. So um yeah, I think it makes sense people say the moon, given yeah, I did a whole
Whole
year-long
thing on the moon.
podcast series on the moon. But yeah, Jupiter is my ascendant ruler and Mercury is conjunct my lot of fortune. So those
There you go.
both of those things kind of make sense too.
That tracks, yeah.
Yeah. Um, cool. Yeah. And in terms of like how much do you think, I'm just curious with the combustion or the, Mercury under the beams ruling your ascendant, how much you like factor in triplicity and like deconic dignity in terms of the alleviation of uh Mercury under the beams.
Yeah, I don't know if I would say it's an alleviation for the combustion. They feel like separate things to
Mm,
me,
mm-hmm,
but it helps. Like I think I feel that Mercury in its own decan very
mm-hmm,
strongly. Like Aquarius 2 to me is the astrologer decan.
mm-hmm,
Like I think T. Susan Chang calls it celestial navigation, and
mm,
Austin Coppock calls it heaven and earth. And it's like this ability to bridge what's out there with what's down here. And so I think in a very real format, we see like mediums and astrologers and, people who are able to be the communicating factor kind of go between
mm-hmm.
those. And I think for me, like with Mercury ruling astrology and stuff like that, it's very on my midheaven in the ninth. Like it's just very literal to me. And
Yeah.
I feel it. I also like moved to a new country and like I became like kind of sovereign in a new place.
Mm-hmm,
And so, yeah, I think that that's really strong. The triplicity dignity, I think, helps as well.
mm-hmm,
I think everything, it always helps, right? Like, it's always like,
mm-hmm.
oh, that adds like a nice little factor. I think of triplicity dignity as like I get by with a little help from my friends dignity.
Yeah. You
And
do have like the triplicity mate that Mercury can see is Jupiter, and Jupiter's in the seventh. So
yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
that's
And
very
so, like,
literal. Like get by with a little help from my friends.
yeah, yeah, definitely. But yeah, like one of those things where it's just like it feels like I do have support, whether it be from my husband or from my friends or things like that, where there is that ability to get, yeah, like aid or even just like the support of my community, honestly. Like I feel like people are
Mm-hmm.
really nice to me, like
Yeah.
online and stuff. Of course there's always going to be people that are my Mars in the third. But for the most part, like I feel like people are really supportive. I have people just send me like astrology resources. Like I just do
Oh,
nothing and they'll
cool.
just be like, here's a thing that I thought you might like. And I'm like, I didn't pay for this or like something
Mm-hmm.
like that. So
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there is that kind of additional support, but I think it feels very different to me than the combustion,
Mm. How
which to
so?
me, the combustion feels a lot more like very kind of intertwined with my Aquarius Sun, where like I have problems with being perceived. Like it's very
Mm,
uncomfortable for me,
yeah.
actually. Gotta have a lot of like materia on to do something like this, you know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Gotta have some magical support.
Yeah.
But I think there's also a thing with like having it be retrograde and combust where like I don't always see how I'm saying something and the impact that might have for better or for worse. Like I could
Mm,
leave a consult and be like, oh, that was not my best work, and then they email me the next day and it was like, that was life changing, like an incredible
wow.
experience,
Yeah.
or when I was younger, it probably played out for worse. And I'm a very honest, like direct person.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I don't realize that the way that I'm saying something is not like the smoothest, or that it
Yeah.
feels like almost like an interview with like people. And I'm just like, I'm just trying to get to know you. And they're like, okay, but
Yeah.
it's like very direct, and I think that there's like that lack of visibility that kind of factors
Mm-hmm.
into that, where I just don't see that that's not the way that most people would communicate, if that
Mm-hmm.
makes sense.
Yeah, and I actually relate to that a lot, which is interesting because I do think, I have this Jupiter moon thing going on too, so I feel like I try to communicate in a way that's very like caring and understanding, but then like the sun and Mercury are in Capricorn, and there is this very like directness with communication sometimes that I
Mhm.
think can be I don't know if off-putting is the word, but
Yeah, it's off-putting.
it can just be very like direct and
Yeah.
kind of blunt.
Mhm.
So I feel like I relate to that in my own ways for sure.
Yeah, not saying you're off-putting, I say in my experience, I think people view me when I do that as off-putting. Like, they're like, "Why
Mm-hmm.
are you asking me?" Like, I'm not a good small talk person.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't really like, I just don't care, and I can't
Yeah.
fake like I do, so just be like, "Oh, like, how do you feel about, like, souls? Like, what's your idea of, like, what happens after we die?" And they're like, "We met 5 minutes ago. Could you, like, back it up?" And I'm just like, "Oh, I didn't realize that that's not something that we can talk
Oh, we
about." But,
weren't supposed to talk about that? Oh,
it's a sorting
gee.
mechanism though,
Okay.
like, those who indulge me, I'm like, "Okay, we can be
Totally.
friends," you
Who
know?
are your people? Yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely. Um, all right, wonderful. Yeah, what suggestions would you have for someone new to astrology or planetary relationship in kind of developing their relationship with the sun?
Yeah, I love that question. I think it's so simple, like, you don't have to overcomplicate it. Like, light a
Mm-hmm.
candle on a Sunday morning, say the hymn if you wanna get crazy with it, and just be. Just see
Mm,
what it feels like. Go outside, sit in the sun. Like, what does that experience teach you? What is the feeling of the sun on your skin,
mm,
like, feel like to you internally and physically? And I think that there's just ways that you can get into that. I also really do love the Orphic hymns, though. I think they're great teaching tools. And the Orphic Hymn to the Sun, I think in particular has like a lot of really good, like juicy tidbits, where it's just like the eye of right, and like, okay, so like the sun rules the right eye, and like of seeds the ruler, and of life the light. There's so many
mm,
things where you can just kind of tease it apart line by line, and you're just going to learn so much about the sun. But if you want to form a
mm-hmm,
relationship, just like say hi, you
mm-hmm.
know? I think that was what Hawk Grubb taught me when I was at the very beginning of forming planetary relationships. They were like, just say hi. Like, you don't need to like do some big thing. Like, it doesn't have to be like a Begatrix ritual where you're reciting like a 6-page invocation and you're dressing a certain way and you're doing all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the planets are already in you and with you all of the time, and
Mm,
they're part of you. So just go be with that part of you, you know?
beautiful. All right, is there anything that you want to add, or do you have any imparting thoughts about the sun before we
I
wrap
don't
up?
think so. I feel like we covered a lot of good stuff,
I think we
hopefully.
did it, Kira.
Awesome.
All right, Kira, where can we find you? And is there anything you're working on that you'd like to share?
You can find me on my website, kiraryberg.com, and just always putting out stuff. You can check out my lectures,
Mm-hmm.
guidebooks. I'll have an electional course dropping soon, so keep an eye out for that. Super
Very
excited about
excited for
that.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
me too. Me too. It's been a long time coming, so just
Mm-hmm.
gotta finish it before the election comes. And then yeah, that's kind of like the main things that I'm working on. You can get a consult with me if you're feeling called, and yeah, just Yeah, I don't know. My Aquarius Sun. I'm like, I don't know, man. Like, just
Yeah.
check out my
Wonderful.
stuff. Whatever calls to you,
Well,
calls to you.
yeah, well, thank you so much for coming on and being vulnerable and letting yourself be visible as a fellow Saturnian. I know how hard that can be. So I just want to say I really appreciate it. And yeah, thank you. I hope that we can talk again soon, Kira. It's
For
always a
sure.
pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
To support the show by donating or becoming a member, please visit my website, which is linked in the show notes. And please subscribe to the show wherever you listen. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter. See those links in the show notes as well. If you have any questions or feedback on the show, please feel free to contact me via my website or email me at spallhorary@gmail.com. In the show notes, you can also find links to astrologers and resources that we touched on in this episode. Thanks for listening to the show. I'll see you next time.